The air at the Henderson County Implement Auction hung thick and heavy, a humid cocktail of diesel fumes, kicked up dust, and the cheap, sweet perfume of hot dogs turning on a roller grill. It was the spring of 1973, and the mood was electric. Grain prices were shooting for the moon. Land was worth more than a man could have dreamed of just 5 years prior, and the banks were handing out money like it was gospel tracts at a revival meeting. Silas Blackwood stood near the back, his arms crossed over his faded denim work shirt. He wasn't here to buy. Not really. He was here to watch, to listen, to take the temperature of the times. His gaze drifted over the rows of equipment lined up in the sun-baked pasture, a steel rainbow of opportunity. Gleaming red International Harvesters, brilliant green John Dells, proud orange Alice Chalmers. Most of it was brand new, dealer consignments with the plastic still on the seats, and the paint so fresh you could smell it 20 feet away. Then he saw him. Warren Miller, holding court near the auctioneer's stand. Warren was the future, or so everyone said. He'd taken over his father's 240 acres the same year Silas had taken over his, but that's where the similarities ended. Warren farmed with the bank's money. He saw debt not as a burden, but as a tool, a lever to move the world. And right now, his world was getting bigger by the minute. The auctioneer, a fast-talking man named Jimmy Dale, whose voice sounded like gravel in a coffee can, was working the crowd up over the prize of the day. A brand-new International Harvester, 1466, a monster of a tractor for its time. It had the big V8 diesel, a factory cab with air conditioning, and a radio, dual rear wheels, and enough horsepower to pull a freight train uphill. It was the physical embodiment of the new farming gospel. Get big or get out. "Look at her, boys," Jimmy Dale hollered into the microphone, sweat beading on his forehead. 145 horses under that hood, ready to work. Who'll start the bidding for me at $20,000? A bargain for a machine that'll change your life. 20,000. Who'll give me 20? Warren Miller's hand shot up without a moment's hesitation, a confident, almost arrogant gesture. The bidding was fierce for a minute, a flurry of nods and raised hands from other ambitious young farmers high on the promise of $5 corn. But Warren never flinched. He just kept nodding, his jaw set, a little smirk playing on his lips. When the dust settled and Jimmy Dale's hammer finally fell, the 1466 was his. $24,500. A gasp went through the crowd. It was more than some farms were worth a decade ago. As the crowd began to disperse, Warren swaggered over toward the concession stand, followed by a few other farmers eager to slap his back and congratulate him. He spotted Silas lingering by an old flatbed wagon loaded with rusty hand tools and used tires. "Well, Blackwood," Warren said, his voice loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Didn't see you bidding on the real equipment. You here to pick up a spare set of wrenches for that old museum piece you call a tractor?" A few men chuckled. Silas didn't rise to the bait. He just turned his steady, blue-eyed gaze on Warren. His hands were calloused and stained with grease, the lines on his face carved by sun and worry, not by ambition. "She's paid for, Warren," Silas said, his voice low and even. "Doesn't ask for much but fuel and a little maintenance. That's more than you can say for some things." Warren laughed, a sharp, dismissive sound. "You can't run a modern farm with a 30-year-old mindset, Si. This is a business now. It's about leverage, cash flow, expansion. While you're out there tinkering with your old John Deere 4020, I'll be farming 3 times the ground in half the time. You're sentimental. That's going to be the death of you." He gestured back at the gleaming red behemoth. "That right there? That's progress. That's the future. You're standing here looking at a wagon full of the past." Silas looked at the new tractor, its paint shining so brightly it hurt the eyes. He could smell the fresh rubber and the clean, unburnt diesel. Then he looked at his own hands, the fingernails permanently rimmed with the black of old grease and rich soil. He knew every bolt and every grease zerk on his 40-20. He knew the particular groan it made on a cold morning and the satisfying hiss of the hydraulics when the three-point hitch lifted a heavy plow. His tractor wasn't an asset on a balance sheet. It was a partner. It was paid for. Maybe, Silas said, finally. But my future isn't owned by the bank. I sleep soundly at night. Warren just shook his head and walked away, the others following in his wake like pilot fish on a shark. Silas watched them go, then turned his attention back to the wagon. He picked up a heavy, American-made pipe wrench, its steel worn smooth with years of use. It felt solid in his hand, dependable. He paid the man $2 for it and headed for his old Ford pickup. The whole way home, Warren's words echoed in his head. The future, progress. Was he a fool for holding on so tight to the past? Now, before we go any further with this story, I have to ask you all a question. Think about the men you've known in your life. The farmers, the mechanics, the factory workers. Have you ever known a man like Silas? A man who believed in owning what he had outright, who stuck to his guns with old iron while the world screamed at him to borrow and buy? Or have you known a Warren, a man who bet the farm on the latest and greatest, who wasn't afraid to take a big risk for a big reward? I want you to drop a comment below and tell me, back in those days, which man you think had it right from the very start. The breakdown came, as they always do, at the worst possible time. It was the first week of May, a narrow window of perfect weather for planting corn. The soil was just right, warm enough to sprout the seed, with enough moisture to carry it through the first few weeks, but dry enough on top to hold the tractor without making a muddy mess. Every farmer in the county was running from sunup to sundown, a frantic race against the calendar and the clouds. Silas was on his 1968 John Deere 40-20, the diesel engine singing its familiar, powerful rhythm. It wasn't a two-cylinder putt-putt like Warren had implied. It was a six-cylinder, a modern classic in its own right, and Silas knew it inside and out. He'd bought it used but in good shape 5 years ago, paying cash he'd saved from 2 exceptional soybean harvests. Behind him, the 6-row planter was dropping seed into the dark, fragrant earth with practiced precision. He loved this work. The smell of the diesel, the sight of the turned soil, the feeling of the big machine responding to his touch. It was more than a job. It was who he was. He was on his last pass of the 80-acre field north of the barn when he felt it. A slight shudder, a hesitation in the hydraulics when he lifted the planter on the headland. It was subtle, something a less experienced operator might have missed. But Silas felt it in the seat of his pants. He frowned, eased the throttle back, and listened. The engine sounded fine, a steady, throaty roar. He tried the hydraulics again. This time the response was sluggish, weak. A cold knot formed in the pit of his stomach. He finished the row, pulled the tractor onto the grass laneway, and shut it down. The sudden silence was deafening, broken only by the chirping of crickets and the metallic ticking of the cooling engine. He climbed down, his boots sinking into the soft earth. First things first, check the fluid. He unscrewed the big dipstick at the rear of the tractor. It was clean and full. Not the easy fix, then. He spent the next hour checking the lines, the filter, the control levers. Nothing. The problem was deeper, internal. He knew, with a sinking certainty, that it was the main hydraulic pump. It was the heart of the tractor's systems, powering the steering, the brakes, and the three-point hitch, and it was buried deep within the transmission housing. It wasn't a field repair. By the time he got the tractor limped back to his workshop, the sun was setting, painting the western sky in brilliant strokes of orange and purple. The sight, normally a source of quiet satisfaction, only deepened his anxiety. Every hour of daylight lost was a gamble against the weather. His workshop was his sanctuary. It was an old converted dairy barn, with a concrete floor he'd poured himself and a ceiling crisscrossed with massive, hand-hewn beams. Tools lined the walls in neat, orderly rows, wrenches, sockets, pullers and presses, some of them belonging to his father and grandfather. In the corner sat his heavy-duty welder and a cutting torch set. The air inside always smelled of cold steel, oil, and the faint, dusty scent of old hay trapped in the rafters. He found the service manual for the 4020, a thick 3-ring binder with greasy, dog-eared pages. He spread it open on his workbench under the harsh glare of a single bare bulb. The diagrams confirmed his fears. To get to the pump, he'd have to split the tractor in two. For the next 3 days, Silas worked. He drained the hydraulic fluid, gallons of it, into clean 5-gallon buckets. He disconnected the fuel lines, the wiring harnesses, the steering linkages. He built heavy wooden cradles to support the front and rear halves of the tractor, then carefully, painstakingly, unbolted the massive cast-iron bell housing. Using a chain hoist suspended from a thick oak beam, he slowly, inch by inch, rolled the front half of the tractor, engine, front axle and all, away from the transmission and rear end. The guts of the great machine were exposed, a complex world of gears and shafts that he now had to navigate. He finally reached the pump, a heavy, intricate piece of machinery, just as he suspected. A keyway on the main drive shaft had sheared clean off. It was a small part, but a catastrophic failure. The next morning, he was at the Napa Auto Parts store in town when the doors opened. The man behind the counter, old Gus, had to blow a layer of dust off the parts catalogue for a '68 Deere. After 20 minutes of squinting at diagrams, he found the part number. "Gonna have to order it from the warehouse in Des Moines, see?" Gus said, peering over his spectacles. "Might take 3 days. 3 days. It felt like a lifetime." As Silas waited for Gus to make the call, the morning coffee crew started to filter into the diner next door. Through the window, he could see them, their heads bent together over their steaming mugs. He knew what they were saying. "Heard Silas's Deere is split in half in his shop. Should have traded it in. Warren Miller's already done with his corn and is moving on to beans." The words were unspoken, but he heard them all the same. Their judgment felt as heavy as the broken pump in his hands. He drove home in a daze of frustration and fatigue. That afternoon, a line of thunderstorms rolled in from the west, the sky turning a bruised purple-grey. The rain came down in sheets, a cold, relentless downpour that lasted for 2 solid days. It was the kind of rain that turns a perfectly tilled field into a sea of mud, a swamp that would be impassable for a week or more. On the 3rd day, the sun came out. The part arrived from Des Moines. The rain, the very thing that had seemed like a curse, had turned into a blessing. It had stopped everyone, not just him. Warren Miller's new 1466, for all its power and air-conditioned comfort, was just as useless in a mud pit as his crippled 4020. The storm had leveled the playing field. That night, working late, he carefully reassembled the pump and slid it back into the tractor's transmission housing. He spent the next day meticulously putting the 2 halves of the tractor back together, torquing every bolt to spec, reconnecting every line and wire. When he was finally done, covered in grease from head to toe, he filled the system with fresh hydraulic fluid, bled the air out of the lines, and climbed into the seat. He turned the key. The starter groaned. The big 6-cylinder turned over once, twice, and then roared to life. He let it warm up, his heart pounding in his chest. He eased the hydraulic lever back. The 3-point hitch arms rose smoothly, powerfully, without a hint of hesitation. A slow grin spread across his face. He had done it. He had faced disaster, and, with his own 2 hands, and a little help from a timely rainstorm, he had won. The cost? A few $100s in parts and 4 days of sweat and grease. A dealer mechanic would have charged him 10 times that and put him at the back of a long list. The next morning, he was back in the field, the 40-20 running better than it had in years. As he worked, he saw Warren Miller's new red tractor on the neighboring farm, finally able to get back into his own fields. The 2 men were miles apart, separated by a fence line, but the gulf between their worlds had never felt wider. The years that followed were a blur of hard work and soaring optimism. The mid-1970s were the golden age for the American farmer. The whole world, it seemed, was hungry for American grain. Prices for corn, soybeans, and wheat hit levels that would have been unthinkable a decade earlier. Land values doubled, and then doubled again. The phrase, dirt rich, became a literal truth. The talk in the cafes and co-ops was all about expansion, of buying more land, bigger equipment, and building taller silos. The government and the universities were all preaching the same sermon. Farm fensero to fensero. Feed the world. For men like Warren Miller, it was vindication. He was a prophet of the new age, and his prophecies were coming true. The massive loan he'd taken out for the 1466 and the new planter looked like a stroke of genius. The high yields and high prices meant he could make the payments with ease and still have a pile of cash left over. He didn't stop there. When the 160-acre farm adjoining his came up for sale, he bought it without blinking, taking on another mortgage that made old-timers shake their heads. To work the new ground, he traded the 1466, only a few years old, for an even bigger model. An International 2+2, the strange-looking but powerful Snoopy tractor with the engine out front. He bought a 12-row planter to go with it, and a brand-new gleaner combine that could harvest 8 rows of corn at a time. His farm was a showcase of modern agricultural power. He built a new house, a sprawling ranch-style home set far back from the road, and a massive new machine shed, a gleaming monument of steel that dwarfed his old barn. He drove a new Lincoln into town, and his wife's diamonds sparkled under the fluorescent lights of the grocery store. He was the undisputed king of Henderson County agriculture. Silas Blackwood, meanwhile, just kept on farming. The good prices were good for him, too. He and his wife, Mary, had never had so much money in their lives. But where Warren saw opportunity for leverage, Silas saw a chance for security. The first thing he did with the windfall was march into the bank and pay off the last of the mortgage his father had taken out 30 years before. The banker, a young man with a fresh business degree who saw Silas as a relic, tried to talk him out of it. "Mr. Blackwood," he'd said, pushing a brochure for a high-interest investment fund across the desk. "With inflation running the way it is, this mortgage is cheap money. You'd be better off putting this cash to work for you. Buy some more land. The value is only going up." Silas had just smiled, pushed the check across the desk and said, "There's no better feeling than owning the roof over your head and the dirt under your feet. I'll take the deed, please." He didn't expand. He didn't buy new iron. He used the extra income to systematically improve what he already had. He put a new steel roof on the big barn. He tore down the old rotting corn crib and built a new, modern grain bin with a drying floor, paying the contractor in cash. He bought a new, bigger welder for his shop and a heavy-duty air compressor. He put new tires on the 4020 and did a complete engine overhaul himself one winter, replacing the pistons, rings and bearings, ensuring it would run for another 20 years. To the rest of the community, he was a fool. A man sitting on a winning lottery ticket and refusing to cash it in. The talk at the diner turned from quiet gossip to open pity. "Poor Cy," they'd say, stirring cream into their coffee. "He's too scared to make a move. He could be set for life, but he's still farming like it's 1950. Warren Miller's gonna own half the county by the time he's 50, and Silas will still be patching together that old deer." One day, Warren himself pulled his shiny Lincoln into Silas's driveway. He got out, looking out of place in his clean khaki pants and polo shirt amidst the mud and gravel of the farmyard. "See," he said, getting straight to the point. "I'll give you a fair price for this place. A good price. More than it's worth, probably. You could take the money, move to town, retire. You're working yourself to death here for pennies." Silas was cleaning out the stalls in the old hog barn, a job he still did by hand with a pitchfork and a wheelbarrow. He stopped, leaned on the fork handle, and wiped a bead of sweat from his brow with the back of a canvas glove. "Why would I sell my home, Warren? It's not a home, it's a business asset, and you're not managing it properly," Warren said, his frustration showing. "I could make this ground produce twice what you do." "This ground produced enough to raise me," Silas said, his voice quiet, but hard as stone. "It produced enough to raise my father before me. It puts food on our table and lets us sleep at night without owing a single soul a single dime. That seems like pretty good production to me. I'm not selling." Warren stared at him for a long moment, a look of genuine disbelief on his face. He shook his head, got back in his air-conditioned car, and drove away, kicking up a cloud of dust that settled over everything. That evening, as Silas sat on his front porch watching the fireflies begin to dot the dusk, the phone rang. It was his brother-in-law, who worked at the Federal Reserve Bank in Chicago. They talked for a while about family, about the weather, about the kids. Then, just before they hung up, his brother-in-law said something that made the hair on Silas's arms stand up. "You be careful out there, Cy," he said, his voice dropping. "All this inflation, it can't last. The new chairman up here, a fellow named Volker, he's talking tough. He's talking about raising interest rates and raising them high to break inflation's back. A lot of folks who are leveraged to the hilt could get caught in a real bad way." Silas hung up the phone, a deep unease settling over him. He walked out to the edge of his fields. The corn stood tall and green, a testament to his hard work. In the distance, across the valley, he could see the bright halogen lights of Warren Miller's new combine. It was well after dark, but Warren was still out there, pushing hard, harvesting the crop that had to cover the payments on his ever-growing mountain of debt. The roar of its massive engine carried on the night air, a sound of immense power, but also, for the first time, a sound of desperation. A storm was coming, a different kind of storm, not of rain and wind, but of numbers on a ledger and decisions made in faraway boardrooms. And Silas had a feeling that all the horsepower in the world wouldn't be enough to outrun it. The whisper started in 1980, a rumor carried on the winter wind alongside the first snowflakes. It began, not in the fields, but on the evening news, with talk of embassy hostages in a country most farmers couldn't find on a map. Then came the words that struck the heartland like a hammer blow. Grain embargo. The endless demand, the insatiable global appetite that had fueled the boom years, vanished overnight. The price of corn at the Henderson County elevator dropped 30 cents in a single day, then another 20 the next. It was like watching a man fall from a great height, a sickening, unstoppable plunge. At the same time, the letters from the bank began to change their tone. The friendly newsletters about expansion opportunities were replaced by stark, single-page notices. The prime interest rate, a number that had been an abstraction for a decade, was suddenly the headline. 10%, 12, 15. The numbers climbed with terrifying speed, a fever chart of a sick economy. Silas's brother-in-law had been right. The man named Volker was waging a war on inflation, and the farmers were the front-line troops, caught in a brutal crossfire. For Silas, the changes were concerning but not catastrophic. His grain bin, bought and paid for, allowed him to hold his crop, to wait and hope for a better price rather than sell into a collapsed market. His biggest expenses were fuel, seed, and fertilizer, and with no loan payments to make, he could absorb the hit. He tightened his belt, told Mary they'd make the old truck last another few years, and kept working. His world had gotten smaller, quieter, but it was still solid beneath his feet. For Warren Miller, the world was coming apart at the seams. His entire operation was built on the assumption of high prices and cheap credit. With one gone and the other inverted, his balance sheet was bleeding red ink. The payments on his land and his fleet of new iron were astronomical, calculated for $5 corn, not $2 corn. The variable rate loans that had seemed so clever just a few years before were now a guillotine hanging over his head. The first real sign of trouble for Warren came that spring. Silas was cultivating his soybeans, the old 40-20 purring along, when he saw it. Warren's massive International 2+02 was sitting silent in the middle of a field, angled awkwardly as if it had died in mid-stride. A dealer's service truck was parked beside it, two mechanics in matching uniforms staring into the open side panels of the articulated beast. The tractor sat there for 3 days. The talk at the co-op was that a series of electronic sensors in the transmission had failed. The part had to be flown in from Moline, and the bill for the repair, labor included, was over $4,000. It was more than Silas had spent on parts for his entire farm in the last 5 years. As the summer of '81 wore on, the cracks in Warren's empire began to show. He was always in a hurry, his face etched with a permanent, deep-set anxiety. The confident swagger was gone, replaced by a tense, hunched shoulder posture, as if he were physically carrying the weight of his debt. Silas saw him at the fuel co-op, arguing with the manager over the price of diesel, his voice tight with desperation. He traded in his new Lincoln for a used Ford sedan. Small things, but in a tight-knit community, they were signals, like flags warning of a coming storm. The worst came during the harvest. Warren's huge Gleaner combine, the pride of his fleet, was a marvel of technology, but its complexity was its weakness. A specialized hydraulic valve body failed, and the dealer, swamped with calls from other farmers in the same predicament, couldn't get a mechanic out for a week. A week, with the corn drying down in the field, losing test weight and value every single day. Silas, working his own fields, would finish his day on his smaller, simpler John Deere 95 combine. It was slow, it was old, and it had no cab, leaving him covered in dust and chaff from dawn till dusk. But it ran. Every night he would clean the filters, grease the fittings, and check the belts. It was a ritual of maintenance and care. As he drove home, coated in the grime of his labor, he'd see Warren's magnificent machine sitting idle under the cold autumn moon, a silent, helpless giant. In that moment, Silas understood. Progress had a price, and sometimes that price was control over your own fate. Warren had built a kingdom that was so complex he was no longer its master. He was its most frantic, powerless servant. The banker, the implement dealer, the oil company, they were the ones who truly held the reins. By the winter of 1982, the storm had broken with full fury. The Henderson County Journal, once filled with stories of record yields and farm expansions, now ran a new, grim feature every week, a stark, black-bordered box announcing a farm foreclosure auction. The names were familiar, families who had worked the same ground for 100 years. The pictures of the farmers, hollow-eyed and defeated, standing on the courthouse steps, were a weekly punch to the gut for the whole community. The whispers about Warren Miller grew louder, turning from speculation to certainty. The bank had called his loans. The sheer scale of his debt was staggering, a number that sounded more like a government budget than a farm's finances. There was no way out. The notice finally appeared in the paper, a full-page ad that felt like an obituary, a complete dispersal sale. All equipment, tools and personal property of Warren and Linda Miller. The day of the auction was cold and grey, the sky the colour of lead. A bitter wind whipped across the farmyard, rattling the bare branches of the oak trees. It was the polar opposite of that sunny, hopeful auction day a decade earlier. The crowd was different too. There were no ambitious young farmers looking to build a future. There were bargain hunters, scrap dealers, and neighbouring farmers, their faces grim, attending out of a morbid sense of obligation. It felt like a wake. Silas was there. He hadn't wanted to come, but Mary had insisted. "You go," she'd said. "You go to bear witness. He's still our neighbour." Warren's magnificent red machines were lined up in a row, just as they had been at the dealer auction. But now they looked different. The paint was faded and mud-spattered. A tire on the 2+2 was low. They didn't look like symbols of progress anymore. They looked like monuments to a dream that had died. The auctioneer's patter was subdued, almost apologetic. There was no energy, no excitement. The bidding was brutal. The International 2+2, which had cost Warren over $100,000 just a few years before, sold for $22,000 to a dealer from out of state. The massive Gleaner combine went for even less. Tools that Warren had bought new were sold in rusty lots for a few dollars. Silas watched as men picked over the pieces of Warren's life, their faces impassive. He felt a profound sadness, not of triumph, but of waste. He saw Warren standing near the machine shed, his back against the steel wall, as if trying to hold it up. His wife Linda was beside him, her arms wrapped around herself against the cold, her face a mask of quiet grief. Warren wasn't the arrogant king anymore. He was just a man who had lost everything. His shoulders were slumped, his eyes vacant. He looked 10 years older than he had a year ago. When the auctioneer finally sold the last toolbox, a profound, empty silence fell over the farmyard. The crowd dispersed quickly, eager to escape the pall of failure that hung in the air. Silas walked over to Warren. He didn't know what to say. "I'm sorry," felt hollow and inadequate. Warren looked up, and for a moment, Silas saw a flicker of the old defiance in his eyes, quickly extinguished by shame. "Come to see the mighty fall, Blackwood?" Warren's voice was a rough, broken whisper. "No, Warren," Silas said, his own voice quiet. "I came because you're my neighbor." Warren stared at him, his jaw working, but no words came out. A single tear traced a path through the grime on his cheek. He turned and walked away, toward the house that would no longer be his in a week, leaving Silas standing alone in the empty yard, the cold wind his only company. While his neighbors were being torn apart by the crisis, Silas endured. His life was stripped to the essentials. He and Mary grew a massive garden, canning and freezing enough vegetables to last through the winter. He took up hunting again, filling their freezer with venison. He stopped buying parts at the dealer altogether, instead driving to the salvage yards that were now overflowing with the wreckage of failed farms. He could find almost any part he needed for his old Deere or his John Deere 95 combine, scavenging from machines identical to his own. His workshop, once his sanctuary, became a source of income. With the local dealership overwhelmed and its labor rates sky high, farmers with older equipment started coming to Silas. "See, my clutch is out. Can you take a look? See, I've got a hydraulic leak I can't find." He never charged much, just enough to cover his time and a little extra. He worked late into the night under the bare bulb, the glow of his welder a beacon in the darkness, fixing the machines that kept his neighbors afloat. He was repairing more than just tractors. He was mending the frayed fabric of his community, one broken part at a time. He wasn't getting rich, but his family ate well. The farm was safe. He owed nothing. In the midst of the worst agricultural depression since the 1930s, Silas Blackwood was a free man. The spring of 1984 brought with it the final, inevitable conclusion to Warren Miller's story. The for sale signs went up, stark white markers of defeat planted in the rich black soil. The bank wasn't selling the land as a single entity. It had been carved up, parcel by parcel, to be sold off to the highest bidder. The new house, the massive machine shed, the prime bottomland. It was all being liquidated. Silas watched the signs go up with a heavy heart. He was especially troubled by the one planted at the edge of the original Miller homestead, the 240 acres that Warren's father had farmed, the place where Warren had grown up. To Silas, that piece of land was different. It wasn't just an asset. It was a legacy. To see it sold off to some faceless investment company from the city seemed like the ultimate desecration. He went home and sat at the kitchen table with Mary, spreading his financial records out before them. They were simple, kept in a spiral notebook, but they were meticulous. For years they had lived frugally, putting every spare dollar into a savings account at the local credit union. It wasn't a fortune, but it was a respectable sum. It was their security, their buffer against the unknown. "What are you thinking, Si?" Mary asked, her hand resting on his shoulder. "I'm thinking about that Miller place," he said, not looking up from the notebook. "The home place. It's not right. What's happening?" "It's not our affair," she said gently. "It is," he replied, finally meeting her eyes. "It's all of our affair. When a neighbor falls that hard, it diminishes us all if we just stand by and watch." The next day, Silas put on his only suit, the one he wore to weddings and funerals, and drove to the bank. He sat across the desk from the same banker who, years ago, had advised him to leverage his assets. The banker's face was grayer now, his confidence replaced by a weary pragmatism. Silas made his offer. Not for the whole of Warren's former empire, but just for the original 240 acres. He offered cash. The banker looked at the number, then at Silas, a new respect dawning in his eyes. He had seen so many men broken in this office over the past few years, men who had bet everything and lost. Here was a man who had bet on himself, on his own skills and restraint, and he was one of the few left standing. The offer was accepted. A month later, Silas found Warren. He wasn't hard to find. He and Linda had moved into a small rental house in town, and Warren had taken a job driving a truck for the county highway department. Silas found him eating his lunch in his pickup, parked by the side of a gravel road. He walked up to the driver's side window. Warren looked up, his face wary. "Warren," Silas began, "I bought your dad's old place, the 240. Warren's face hardened. "Come to rub it in? Show me what a smart man you were, and what a fool I was." "No," Silas said firmly. "I came to make you a proposition. I want to rent it to you, a cash rent agreement. The price will be fair, I promise you that. You can move back into the house. You can farm it again." Warren stared at him, dumbfounded. "Why? Why would you do that?" "Because no one should lose their home," Silas said simply. "And because that land deserves to have a miller farming it." He paused, then added, "I'll need some help myself. My boy, he's coming back to the farm after school, and I'll need an extra hand, especially with repairs. I could use a man who knows his way around those big red machines. I'd pay you a fair wage." Warren looked out the windshield at the rolling hills of Henderson County, the land he had tried to conquer, and that had, in turn, broken him. His pride wrestled with his desperation. He had lost his kingdom, but here was an offer, an act of unbelievable grace that gave him a chance to reclaim a small piece of himself. I don't know what to say, Si," he stammered, his voice thick with emotion. "Just say you'll think about it," Silas said. He turned and walked back to his truck, leaving Warren alone with the most unexpected thing he had encountered in years, a seed of hope. The years that followed saw a slow healing. Warren accepted Silas's offer. He and Linda moved back into the old farmhouse. He rented the land from Silas, and he worked part-time in Silas's shop. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a quiet, hard-working humility. The two men, once rivals, became friends, bonded by a shared love for the land and a deep understanding of the risks it entailed. The talk in the diner changed. They no longer spoke of Silas as a fool or Warren as a failure. They spoke of Silas's wisdom, of his quiet strength. He had become what his father had been, a pillar of the community, a man whose advice was sought and whose handshake was a sacred bond. One warm summer evening, years later, Silas sat on his front porch. He was older now, his hair completely white, his hands gnarled with arthritis, but his eyes were still clear and sharp. His son, David, a young man with his father's steady gaze, was now running the day-to-day operations of the farm. In the distance, Silas could hear the familiar, throaty rumble of the John Deere 4020. David was out cultivating the last of the soybeans. The tractor was over 30 years old now, its green paint faded and patched, but its engine ran as sweet as the day it was made. It was more than a machine. It was a member of the family, a symbol of their survival. His grandson, a boy of 10, came and sat on the steps beside him. "Grandpa," the boy asked, "why do we still use that old tractor? Uncle David says the new ones can drive themselves with computers." Silas smiled and put a heavy hand on the boy's shoulder. He looked out over his fields, green and vibrant under the setting sun. Across the valley, he could see the lights of the Miller farmhouse, where Warren's own son was now farming, slowly buying the land back from Silas, piece by piece. "Well," Silas began, his voice a low, gentle rumble, "that old tractor taught me something important. It taught me that it's not about being the biggest or the fastest or having the shiniest new thing. It's about knowing what you have and taking care of it. It's about owning your work and not letting the bank or anyone else own you. That tractor doesn't have a computer, but it has character. We know every bolt, every lever, every sound it makes. When it breaks, we know how to fix it with our own two hands." He pointed a thick finger toward the workshop, where the lights were on. "The most important tool on this farm isn't a tractor or a combine. It's what's in there. It's the knowledge of how things work and the willingness to get your hands dirty. You remember that?" The boy nodded, his eyes wide, trying to grasp the weight of the lesson. The sound of the 40-120 grew closer as David finished the last row. The engine idled down, its work done for the day. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in strokes of orange and purple. A profound sense of peace settled over the farm. Silas Blackwood had never conquered the world. He hadn't built an empire. He had simply held on, with quiet dignity and calloused hands, to what was his. And in the end, that had been the greatest victory of all.